Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to look at how fiction, specifically diaspora novels, can help us completely untangle some of the most complex, politically charged history of the 20th century. Today, we're zooming in on the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, and we're going to analyze exactly how diaspora fiction gives us this incredibly unique lens to critique rigid nationalism. Because, as you'll see, these novels help us understand the deeply human realities that official state histories often, well, just choose to leave out.
Just look at how fractured and layered this feels. This abstract piece, or John, perfectly sets our literary tone for today. It's an incredible visual representation of the shattered memories and the incredibly complex historical trauma of the post-colonial subcontinent. When a nation is literally torn apart, the memories of that event, they don't just exist in neat, straight lines. They're messy, they overlap, and they constantly clash. And honestly, that is exactly the landscape our authors are navigating.
So, here is our roadmap for today. First, nationalism and the 1971 war. Then, defining the cosmopolitan lens. Third, uncovering trauma in Rahman's fiction. Fourth, mapping conflict in Shamsi's cartography. And finally, reimagining belonging through literature. Let's get right into it.
Section 1, Nationalism and the 1971 War.
To really grasp why these novels are such a big deal, we first need to understand the real-world historical tension they're actually responding to. You see, official state narratives on both sides of the 1971 conflict have developed these incredibly rigid ways of viewing history. And national narratives often function by just silencing any marginalized voices that don't fit the approved storyline. For example, back in 2011, there was this massive controversy in Bangladesh over a film called Meher Jan. It sparked total outrage among Orthodox nationalists. Why? Simply because it showed a cross-cultural romance between a Bengali woman and a deserting soldier from West Pakistan during the war. It just goes to show that any narrative that strays from the strict nationalist framing gets met with intense hostility. Now, what's really interesting about this is when you impartially map out the opposing blind spots of both nations side by side, a super clear pattern emerges. On one hand, you have Bangladesh's narrative, which strictly polices historical memory and basically rejects cross-cultural nuances, like we literally just saw with that film Meher Jan. Then, on the other hand, you have Pakistan's national memory. They often frame 1971 through this lens of Sukute Dhaka, or the fall of Dhaka, emphasizing the geopolitical loss of territory, while largely glossing over the incredible violence the military unleashed on the civilian population. So both nations are basically constructing these rigid memories that leave almost zero room for nuance, or more importantly, empathy. Which brings us to a huge, pivotal question. With all this intense political hostility and guarded historical memory, can literature actually offer a space for dialogue? When states build walls around their history, can fiction somehow carve out a window? Section 2, Defining the Cosmopolitan Lens. Well, scholars suggest the answer to that question is a resounding yes. And the tool that makes it all possible is what we call the cosmopolitan lens. This is the alternative framework our diaspora authors use to critique nationalism. Now, when you hear the word cosmopolitan, you probably picture, I don't know, a wealthy traveler jet-setting across the globe, right? But literary scholar Bruce Robbins defines it much more profoundly. He describes cosmopolitanism as valuing a negative relation to nationality without giving up an insistence on belonging. Basically, it's a deliberate political choice. It's choosing to reject toxic, narrow nationalism, while still recognizing that, hey, humans inherently need a sense of place. You can absolutely love where you're from without subscribing to state-sponsored jingoism. So, how does this actually work on the page? Cosmopolitanism is basically a tool for connection. It explicitly rejects that parochial nationalism and instead prioritizes empathizing with the other, the folks sitting on the opposite side of the border. It cultivates overlapping allegiances, meaning you can actually belong to more than one culture at once. And here's the absolute best part. It includes what scholar Timothy Brennan calls non-elite cosmopolitanism. We're not just talking about wealthy intellectuals at fancy universities here. This is about everyday, working-class people finding ways to bridge massive cultural divides through shared human experiences. Section 3, Uncovering Trauma in Rahman's Fiction. Let's see this in action, applying this cosmopolitan lens to our first text, Zia Haidar Rahman's brilliant diaspora novel, In the Light of What We Know. This book brings together two absolutely fascinating protagonists. First up is the narrator, who comes from this privileged Pakistani background. We find out his father, who's a cosmopolitan physics professor, actively dissented against the Pakistani military campaign in 1971. The guy faced total social ostracization in the US just for speaking out against his own country's nationalism. Then we have Zafar. He's this brilliant but deeply troubled man who we eventually discover is a war child, born as a direct result of sexual violence committed during the 1971 conflict. Their relationship is the vehicle that drives this entire historical exploration. And this quote right here brilliantly illustrates that concept of non-elite cosmopolitanism we were just talking about. In the novel, Zafar takes a job in London working for a white British working-class carpenter named Bill. At one point, Bill accidentally uses a racial slur, gets corrected, and then drops this incredible line. "A Paki comes from Pakistan. You, my boy, are from Bangladesh. And as anyone who watched George Harrison's 1971 concert for Bangladesh will tell you, Bangladesh didn't fight a bloody war with Pakistan just to have the likes of us calling its good people Pakis." Think about how wild that is. A global rock concert literally empowered a working-class British guy to deeply understand the geopolitical birth of Bangladesh. It gives Zafar this profound moment of feeling seen, entirely outside of elite academic circles. So the crucial point here is how Zafar ultimately navigates his incredibly traumatic origins. He actually travels to a remote village in Sylhet, Bangladesh, to find his biological mother. Now she is a Birangana, a war heroine who survived sexual violence. But instead of finding some broken victim, Zafar finds a woman capable of immense motherly tenderness. When she embraces him, he finally overcomes this lifelong feeling of disconnection. Through this deeply personal, intensely human connection, Zafar constructs his identity and his sense of home completely outside the rigid, nationalist labels the state tries to enforce. It's a real game changer for him. Section 4, Mapping Conflict in Shamsi's Cartography. Okay, let's switch gears and look at another absolute masterpiece of diaspora literature to see how a different author uses cosmopolitanism to critique borders. I'm talking about Kamila Shamsi's novel Cartography. Set largely in Karachi, Pakistan, the story follows two characters, Kareem and Raheen. Now, Kareem is literally obsessed with maps. It's his whole thing. But as the story unfolds, Raheen uncovers the dark, silenced history driving that obsession. Back in 1971, Kareem's mother, Maheen, who was ethnically Bengali, was living in West Pakistan. And due to the intense anti-Bengali prejudice during the war, she was essentially abandoned by her fiancé, who happens to be Raheen's father. Kareem is using maps as a coping mechanism to deal with the historical erasure of his mother's identity. There's this deeply symbolic moment where Kareem writes down the word cartographers for Rahim, literally forming a circle with the letters. His obsession isn't just about geography, you know. It represents this profound desire to unmake and redraw the fractured map of Pakistan. He desperately wants to escape the toxic nationalism that humiliated his mother and completely tore his family's history apart. He's relying on maps to envision a world where your belonging isn't dictated by the state's rigid ethnic boundaries. Let's move to and see how this builds, because Shamsi doesn't just leave us in 1971. In the novel, Kareem forces Raheen to draw direct, uncomfortable parallels between the ethnic persecution of Bengalis in 1971 and the violent ethnic clashes targeting Muhajir immigrants in Karachi during the 1990s. In both of these cases, rigid nationalist policies were driving the hostility. And in both cases, the privileged, upper-class elites managed to just completely ignore the trauma happening right in their own backyards. Kareem's cosmopolitan lens forces Raheen, and by extension us as readers, to strip away that class privilege and finally look at the marginalized people suffering right in front of them.
Section 5, Reimagining Belonging Through Literature.
All right, this brings us to the core of our explainer. Let's synthesize exactly how both of these novels solve that historical problem we talked about at the very beginning. The big takeaway here? Diaspora novels create a vital space for dialogue that official state politics almost always shuts down. While nations are busy building walls, cementing these rigid historical narratives, and silencing marginalized voices, literature steps in and acts as a cosmopolitan bridge. By focusing on the intimate, human stories of characters like Zafar and Kareem, these authors basically force us to empathize with the other. They show us that true belonging totally transcends national borders, and that critiquing nationalism is absolutely crucial. It's the very first step toward genuine healing.
So, I'm going to leave you with a question to really chew on. If nationalism is specifically designed to draw strict lines to keep the other out, how does the fiction you read redraw those maps in your own mind? Literature has this incredible power to dismantle borders, but only if we're willing to read with a cosmopolitan lens. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep exploring the stories that challenge how you see the world.